Okay, so we've seen what our publisher looks like that's creating our pseudo data and sending it to our Mosquito broker. So what do we need different for our subscriber? Well, we're going to use pretty much the same types of things. We're going to create our instance of our client. We're going to actually go in then and we're going to subscribe. So we saw before I have test bandwidth, test power, test temp, test heat, and test temp, or test heat and test power as my topics. And then on each one of those, I had sensor 1 through 5. Well, this just says, hey, when we subscribe, just subscribe to everything under the test topic. So I inherit suddenly everything down below, and I can listen to all of those. Now we will be adding one more function, and that's our client on message function. And that says when we actually receive a message, what do we do with it? Well, we're going to get the topic, right? So I can then take that topic and actually down here, I decode that topic to pull out the sensor name and then to pull out the value down here from our message string. So what this one says, and we're going to have one for each of these, that if heat is in the topic, so if it's all going to say test / something / sensor number, but I'm looking for the ones that say heat. So I'm going to decode those, and I'm going to create a function called persists heat. And that function is simply going to take the sensor name and the temperature, and that persists heat is actually going to drive that data into our InfluxDB database. So what this is it's simply going to read the topic name. If it's heat, do this. If it's temp, do that. Or if it's power, do that. Or if it's BW, I think I have for bandwidth, in our topic name, do the following. I do this just because it's easier to call the voltage, call the temperature, and call the bandwidth JSON files to get them set up properly as I push them into the database. So what that looks like is, again, we're going to also in this, we're going to connect to our Influx client. We give it the place we're going to connect, the port number, and the database. And we're going to define here our persists functions. So these are called from our message callback functions, right? We're going to figure out which one to call, and we're going to pre-build this function where we pass the sensor name and we pass the value that we're going to pass. Then you saw before, we're going to grab the current time, and we're going to build our JSON body, where our measurement, and now you have to think about this, this is the table in the database, is called a measurement. The measurement we're going to use here is called temperature. Our tags are sensor and the sensor name, which we've passed it as into the function, so that'll be sensor 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The current time, which we just created right here. And the value, which is what we passed it, and this is the random number that we made up that's appropriate. And then we're going to write this JSON body into our database. And that's all we have to do to take the code off the MQTT bus. When the message comes in, we call the right function. It packages it up into a package that the database can read, right? It's looking for the measurement, the tags, the time, and the fields. You push that into your time-sensitive database, and voila, you've got a record in the correct measurement with the correct tags and the correct fields. And you'll see later how we use that information in our Grafana to actually attach the data we're looking at with the correct sensor name using our time scale with the right values. So what we've done there is we've taken the data out of our message as it comes in, we trap it, we call the right function, we pass it the sensor name and the value, and it writes it out to the database. So let's look at what that code looks like. So as we look at the code we're going to be using here, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to import that same MQTT library. This way we can get our messages as they come into the message queue. We're going to have to import our InfluxDB client because here's what we're going to use to write the message out. And then we use date time to get the current time so that we can create a string. So first thing we're going to do is define our functions of what to do when we receive a message on a certain topic. So we're going to define 3 of those, and they look fairly similar. I'll point out what the differences are, but we're going to do power, we're going to do one called heat, and then we're going to do one called bandwidth. We're going to pass in from our message later on what our sensor name is and what the value is we need to pass in the database from our message. So this is called, when we receive a message, we're going to call the correct function based on what channel it's coming in on. Again, we create the current time, we take it, this measurement is voltage. You see for the heat one, it's called temperature, and for the bandwidth one, it's called bandwidth. Down here, we create that JSON body, and we're going to pass it off to our database. So the persists functions are called to take the data we've taken out of our message and pass it on to a database. Again, they're almost exactly the same. Actually, the real difference here is the measurement tag. I could have just done one here. I don't know why I wrote 3 of them. That's a way to make your code better and faster, stronger. But I actually like to make it very clear here when teaching it. So I've written 3 different functions based on the different sensor names here to call from the message queues. Again, the print statement, you don't need that. That is simply just to show that I'm trying to watch my output and make sure that it looks correct. Okay, so we defined our logging function before. That's the same. Our onConnect and our disconnect functions. But again, on this one, we're defining our onMessage function that gets called once a message comes in. So again, we're going to get our topic, and we're going to look, again, I just printed out to make sure I'm watching this as it goes. I actually comment a lot of these out when I go into production with these. If there's heat in the topic, or power in the topic, or bandwidth, I'm going to pull the correct bit of information out. One of the reasons these are separate is I'm only pulling a 3-value code out for both the temperature range and for the power range, but my bandwidth is actually a 4 integer value here. The 7 just pulls the first 7 strings off, which gives you the sensor name. So we take it in, we go through here, we decode the message, we take out the sensor name, we take out the value, and we pass it to the correct function. So this one, persist heat, I send it the sensor name and temperature. Back up here for persist heat, I take that sensor name and temperature in, I add the time to it, I build my database record, and I push the record through to the database. So these 2 functions here, both the loop callback function and the persist function we looked at above, actually decode the message, send it to the right function to actually build the correct body and push it off to the database. The rest of it looks fairly similar. We're going to set our broker here. I happen to be running localhost. You can do all of these various components on one host to show this off. Here's my DB client call, right? Or my influx client call to connect to the database. Here is my MQTT client call where I create my Python subscriber. I actually add the client on message here. I actually, of course, have already marked out the logging message because that gets very verbose, and I've got enough print statements in here that I can see everything. But that's there in case you want to send it to a logging server. Don't forget to do that. Finally, I'm going to do things a little bit different on the receive side. Instead of starting and stopping my loops and disconnecting, this is really just a program which will run and always be listening, right? So I'm going to use something called loop forever. Loop forever just creates the loop and listens to it and just runs the loop functions, the callback functions, and doesn't really do anything in the main function other than when the callback functions call the persist functions above, they'll write the database record and push that off. So here we connect to the broker, All right, I put a connection message on. We subscribe to everything in the test topic stream, right, which is the same as saying subscribe to all the sensors in power, heat, and bandwidth, right? You could do the same thing on each one of those. This number just says connect to all of them. And then go ahead and loop forever. And this just runs as it gets messages in. It will decode the topic, call the write persist function, create the payload, call the write persist function, and the persist function will create the JSON body and write it out to the database. So that's all there is to this code. From here, we're going to take a look at how this runs and what it looks like.